Jude Barback, the editor of Education Central. Actually, I'm the editor of Education and Health Products for NZME Educational Media down in Wellington. I'm actually based in sunny Papamoa, which it's not so sunny today. The normally sunny Papamoa in the Bay of Plenty, where I work from home. So it's a nice little gig there, but it's lovely to get out and about and see some familiar faces and meet some new people and be part of these sorts of discussions. So Education Central is around coming up to 2 years old now. It's published by NZME, which you will all be familiar with. You publish the Herald and regional papers and News Talk ZB. But what we do with Education Central is we pull all the education content from those sources, as well as create our own with opinion pieces and premium feature content, in the hope of creating a place that's good for teachers and teacher students and educators and parents and researchers to come and congregate. It's going really well, and the next part of that journey has been to pull the content off the page and to bring it into sort of live debate and discussion, because at Education Central we don't see ourselves as sort of distant from education itself. We see ourselves part of the sector. So it's hugely exciting and an absolute privilege as a journalist to be involved with the likes of the panel here, to have these sorts of discussions. So I'm personally humbled and honoured that you would come to this, and we've had some great discussions for our first few ChalkTalks. We had a robust one on the NCEA review. We've had an excellent one on tomorrow's schools review. And so now here tonight we are to talk about teacher education. There hasn't been so much of a strong review like the other two have been, but actually it slots into every part of the education system wherever we look at it, wherever point we turn. So that's why I think it's a pretty poignant topic to address. So without me rambling on all night, we'll leave it to our panel to do that and to discuss some of the issues. So here with me tonight we've got Liam Cunningham. Liam's a master's student at AUT. He's on the Masters of Teaching and Learning program there. So welcome, Liam. Thank you for joining us. We've got Dr. Michelle Johansson beside Liam there. Michelle is program director at Teach First NZ. And we've got Dr. Mark Barrow sitting in the middle here. Mark is not unfamiliar turf here. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Social Work here at the University of Auckland. And beside Mark we have Craig Holt, who is the principal of Willow Park School. Craig is also the president of the Auckland Primary Principals Association. And beside Craig we have Pauline Barnes, who I haven't actually properly met yet. Hi Pauline.
But we've texted each other.
And Pauline is the General Manager at for Professional Services at Teaching Council. Yep. Is that right? Great. Didn't even have to check my notes.
Yes, very well done.
Well done.
Impressive.
So let's get cracking. No, I didn't really want to start my first question to be a negative one as such, but I feel like it's the elephant in the room a little bit when we discuss the teaching profession at the moment, and we can't really separate all that's going on, all the political noise, the strikes, the disharmony out there, without addressing that. So Craig, I'm going to throw you under the bus first.
Sure.
Craig, as a principal, what are your thoughts on where teaching's at the moment?
I haven't seen it as bad as what I'm pretty green behind the ears for some people in the room. I've been in it for 25 years now, but it's probably at the lowest ebb I've seen it. And, I think somebody out there needs to be really politically brave and actually start to dig in and look at what it costs to educate a child in New Zealand and actually start to form policy based around that. Let's stop. And okay, that's probably going to mean that for some of us it's going to be a discussion around higher tax and all those sorts of horrible things. But actually I think we're at that point. We can't afford what we want. And somebody out there needs to be brave and make that decision that they're going to do what's best for kids and for society in the long term, rather than what's fiscally viable now and what's politically popular.
So Mark, where does teacher education slot into that?
Well, I mean, I think it slots in, but sort of indirectly. Just to pick up where we left off then, I mean, unless young people and people who want to get into teaching can see that society values it, then people are going to step away. We need the signals that things like salary increases give to society. We need those signals out there so that we can attract the best and the brightest into teacher education. And without the government giving those signals, that's, it just makes it, our job as teacher educators, much, much more difficult. And I think that, it needs to be an across-the-board thing. There's too much ideological partisanship in education in New Zealand where governments of different stripes just pull education in completely different directions. And what we actually need is some cross-party consensus, and to pick up on the points that have just been made, some long-term thinking about, if we're not going to deliver everything that teachers want now, what is the pathway to getting there? Because I think that you listen to parents, you listen to teachers, you listen to academics. Everybody's saying this is where we need to be, but we need to have a pathway to get there. If it can't be delivered by Chris Hipkins on Thursday when he meets with the unions, then what is the pathway to get there? So, let's do it. It's been, if you were sitting on the top of the basic scale as a basic scale teacher, you won't have had a pay increase for 10 years. I mean, how is that acceptable in any society? For people we value to educate our young people. It's completely unacceptable, really.
And I've read in a recent opinion article you wrote about how the Tertiary Education Commission rewards doctors upon their graduating year, but not teachers. And why do we value one profession over another in different ways like that? I mean, what are your thoughts, Liam? Is it someone coming to as a student about to embark on this world?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time entering the profession. And I think for myself and the others in my year level, we're all aware of what teaching is like in New Zealand at the moment. You'd be very naive not to be aware of that. So we've all gone into the course, we know what the pay is like, we know what the working conditions are like, or we think we do. And we've still made that decision to go in. So it's an interesting position. I think you'd definitely be attracting more high quality teachers if the profession was valued more than what it currently is. But as a student going in with a 1-year degree, I made this decision 6 months ago and here I am. So it's an interesting time.
I mean, just picking up on what you said about the cross-party partisanship, I feel like that's everyone's saying yes we need to have that, and it's just becoming rhetoric now because we're not seeing any meaningful steps to get there. Would the panel agree with that, or do you think we're making progress towards some sort of consensus, Michelle?
Sorry, is it obvious?
Clearly she got no.
Yeah, I feel like we entered sort of the education conversations with such great hope for what might happen, and I feel like we've just been sold the same thing back again, just in slightly different packaging. And I also have some thoughts on that. I feel like if you go to your doctor and with your complaints, and then the doctor says to you, well, what do you think we should do? It's not really a valuable conversation to be having. So I feel like not enough was brought to the table in those conversations, right? Not enough change.
Pauline, I want to pick up your thoughts on because obviously the ITE program requirements, part of that was to leverage the status of the profession, wasn't it? And that was one of the underpinning rationale behind that. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, so the Teaching Council, when it was established as the Education Council, its purpose in law is to lift the status of the teaching profession. So we had to do a lot of thinking around, well, what does that actually mean and how can a professional body do that? And actually out of that conversation came the beginning of the work around initial teacher education. Well, what's really important to teachers and the profession for the future? Actually, we need to start there. And so this is one of the reviews that was profession-led rather than government-led, if you like. And so the work that we've done over the last 3 years has been actually having those broad conversations. What do we want initial teacher education to look like for the future? With that lifting the status in mind, but actually that very quickly becomes just one thing that is really important. So if I see what was the driving passion for the review, I'd say that was a thing that we kind of kept our eye on, but it's just a thing on the side really, because it's not something that you can directly influence by just one thing.
So, I mean, they come into practice, what, July this year?
Yep.
It's in a matter of days, I guess, really, weeks. Do you think they're going to be reinforcing what's already happening or raising the bar?
What we've tried to create, and I say we, meaning we, leaders from the profession, teachers, ITE providers, academics, we have worked with government. We've come to something that I think we can all support, which is a framework for the future. So we've tried really hard to say, what does teacher education need to look like in terms of program design? What do we expect graduating teachers to be able to do, and how do we build confidence of practitioners in that? And how do we make it flexible enough that it's not out of date 5 minutes after you publish it? So we've tried to create a framework that says, here are the principles that you're trying to meet in the system, and let's enable flexibility, enable innovation, but be really clear about what the outcomes are we're trying to achieve. So in some ways, I think it's almost like a recipe for how you get to the future rather than what the future is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Mark, I mean, how do you feel like a provider like Auckland will work with the requirements? I know you've got some strong thoughts on.
Well, and at Auckland, we'll be reasonably early in the process and talking to the Teaching Council about getting our reinvigorated programs approved. So there's been actually a conversation that probably has run almost the same amount of time as the Teaching Council has been running the conversation about what our new program should look like in terms of a conceptual framework, in terms of how we think we should partner with our practice community in terms of assessment. So we've had a very long conversation. So I think we spent quite a long time, as I think all providers did, trying to sort of best guess where we thought the council might end up. And I think that actually we did a pretty good job of guessing, because, I don't suppose it was much of a secret. There was lots of conversation going on. But, where it actually landed was always going to be, until they were actually released, we didn't know. But I think we've spent a long time thinking about just the sorts of things that Pauline's been talking about, is what is the best way that we can actually have people prepared for the classrooms of the future, and what are the elements our programs need to have in place to make that happen.
So let's talk about one of those elements. Like, what about? I'm keen to hear the panel's thoughts on the amount of practicum in a program, and where the balance shifts between theory and practice, and that. Michelle, thoughts on that coming from the teach first angle or in general?
Yeah, I do think that nothing prepares you for the classroom like the classroom, but I also think obviously that theory is absolutely necessary as well. I would like a rethinking of what we mean by academic rigour and intellectual rigour. Like, I would like us to consider the bicultural foundations of this country. I'd like us to consider different ways of knowing and being in the world, but that doesn't diminish the sort of theoretical rigour that I think needs to be present in ITE generally. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that different people, they develop at different times as well. Like, we have Te Reo Māori teachers who are ready to teach on day one and stand up in front of a class and teach, but they may need some of the theoretical underpinning to back that, and vice versa. We'd have PhDs in physics who are not ready to stand in front of a class, but they have all the intellectual capacity they understand how the mind works and how teenagers function and all those things. Yeah.
Yeah,
different and diverse.
It needs to respond to the people within the system, and that's probably what you're saying too. It can't be a hard and fast. It needs to look like this, and I suppose on a structural level, it probably needs to be. But if you can't respond to the person in front of you in terms of, they need more time within the classroom or they need more time within an academic environment, then you're probably not going to get the balance right for those people on either side of the curve. So the system needs to be able to adapt. So whatever we put in place, there needs to be flexibility in there for the providers to put in place what's right for that cohort or that person, like we do with kids.
But surely that creates challenges for the schools and for the providers.
One of the things I say to when we have porphyry, when we welcome our students onto this campus, one of the things that I've been saying to them is actually, is particularly if they're coming into our graduate programs where they've already got an undergraduate program, to pick up on your, doctorates in physics. What they've spent, in the case of the doctorate, perhaps 7 years doing is developing the habits of mind of a physicist. They've got an ontological and an epistemological frame that is about physics and how physics works. What we've got is a year to actually get them to start thinking as educators and what that means. And you can't do that with just spending time in a classroom, and you can't do that with just spending time here. You actually have to have some of the social theory, some of the social science thinking that's gone on, that underpins education, and actually take that into a classroom and test that and go, okay, so I learnt this, I've seen this, how am I changing as a person? How am I turning myself into a teacher? And there is just, in my view, no way that you can do that if you just are in a practice setting or if you are just in a university. It has to be the mix of the two of them. The balance is actually very hard to get right, and there is very, very little evidence, if any, to say what that balance should be. We've got good ideas about what good practicum looks like and what good university education looks like. What the mix between those is something that every provider comes up with their own. To pick up on the point you're making, thinking about its learners, its practice community, what is the right mix?
So Liam, from your personal experience of this practicum theory, what's your takeaway from it? What do you value? Have you valued your practicums and the balance that you've had on your course so far, or how does it work?
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. I think that there does need to be a mix, obviously, of theory and of practical. But what I've seen in my course is they're related. It's not, I'm going to a school and then I'm going to uni.
No.
What we're doing at uni is closely linked with the school and with the teaching standards, helping us for graduation. And it's for me, one of the most important parts of teaching is building relationships. If you're not in the school, it's quite hard to build those relationships with the kids.
I think I read the Teaching Council had some research on that they believe now that fewer longer practicums are better than shorter, more frequent practicums. Is that right? Is that the general
And for
thing?
that point of relationships, if you're going to make relationships with the children in your care and with their whānau, then it's pretty hard to do that in a really short period of time. I think in that literature review that we commissioned, the fact that we commissioned it in itself was interesting, because the conversation that we're having is what started that when we started talking about what do we want for the future, very quickly became evident that length of practicum was kind of irrelevant, because actually the quality of that practical experience and how you made sure that it was seamless, so that there's not a separation between what you're learning theoretically and what you're practicing, that the student shouldn't feel like they're different parts of a process. They should be really integrated. And so that literature review really pulled out some of where there is evidence around that, some different ways of doing it, some case studies, and from that we've built what our expectations are, I suppose.
I wanted to pick up on the point that was made a little earlier about how different learners learn in different ways. Just as you said, Craig, in the classroom we cater for that in our tamariki, but for our teacher students, do you think we've got further to go in terms of giving them more flexible pathways through their course, through their teacher education?
Yeah, I think what Liam said though around connection is probably the thing.
Right.
And I know it's really important, particularly through the practicums. When I went through, you had to go to certain deciles and a mixture of schools and those sorts of things, which is really, really important in terms of learning that the nature of what you're going into, but also that long-term connection, seeing children from the beginning of a year to an end of a year, from coming into graduating out of a class, is also really, really important. So having that connection, for a longer period of time with a school and its people, learning systems and understanding, long-term the workload and all of the bits that go into it, I think it is just as important.
And touching on diversity here, it's a good topic that comes up, and I think all of you mentioned it in a sort of a pre-panel discussion question around the biggest challenges, and that it came up, I think, in everyone's answer that biggest challenge was getting a more diverse teacher workforce, and that came into getting a more diverse teacher education intake. I asked you the question, you all said it was the challenge. Well, have we got any thoughts on how we achieve that diversity in our intake?
Some good things are happening now, actually. So one of the things that I'm actually quite proud to admit is that the council never thinks, oh, look, we know the answer to something. We very deliberately, in everything we've done, kind of taken the stance of, well, we're here to facilitate the conversation and then figure out the way forward. And this is an area where actually we're kind of following some really good things that are already happening, and then making sure that our requirements are flexible enough to empower those good things to happen. So there's some examples where a cohort of where we have really fluent Māori speakers has been identified, and now we're thinking about how do you design a program that would attract them into teaching, because that wasn't where they were thinking to go, and what would they need. So it's kind of student-centred design that helps them staircase in. We've got another iwi that we're working with some kura in their local area, and they were already coming together. They actually didn't know about the Teaching Council's role in this. So when we connected, it was a kind of conversation around, so what were you doing, why were you doing it? And it was all about getting a diverse group of teachers that they wanted to service their rohi in their area, and so we've got around that and helping them find a provider that will kind of connect that up. So I think there are great examples of people with ideas of how to address particular groups or a more diverse workforce, and we're going to have to kind of find some of those integrators, if you like, that can pull those ideas together and turn them into something that will work. That's one thing that's happening.
And then how to roll those out into other, so that was a good example that worked in this place. How do we make that work?
Yeah, and throw it up as something that others could follow.
Yeah. I do think, though, that we, when I was looking at the questions that you sent us earlier, one of the things we need to be thinking about is this is a system, and it needs to be a joined-up system. So it's, I've got them written down here, the figures of, and I presume when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about ethnic diversity and so on. And usually when you have an equity conversation, what you're saying is, does the population in the classroom or in our intake match the population of the city? Well, actually, in this university, it does, in fact, in initial teacher education. So, I'm not suggesting we've solved the problem. We haven't. There's lots of work still to do. But actually, we need to retain those people in the classroom when they get there, because actually, a lot of these people that Pauline's talking about who are fluent Māori speakers, for example, the world is their oyster. When they finish with us, they have to have a very attractive offer out there to keep them in teaching, because there will be lots of other people in government and all sorts in local councils who want them desperately. And if those people are able to provide better conditions and better pay, those people are going to leave teaching. So we need the whole system to join up and actually think, these are people we really need to value. How do we keep them in the classroom?
Is there anything that providers can do beyond if we push aside the pay and the conditions for a moment? We'll come back to that.
Sorry.
We'll sort
I'm your
that
best
out.
ally.
But from a teacher education provider's point of view, what can we do to support teachers instead of once they're, or is it already happening? I might be a bit ignorant on this. So are the support networks there for when teachers are in the classroom, they've graduated there, or are they just off into the world and good luck? What's the feeling?
Yeah, there's fairly robust systems within schools to support beginning teacher. I think, we'd all experience probably variance within that, just like there's in any system. But I think there's, teachers get support for 2 years when they go out, and it obviously tapers off in the second year. But the systems are fairly robust in terms of the support they get. So.
I mean, I would say initial teacher education is quite a long process.
Right.
If you're thinking about somebody in a 1-year program like Liam, 3 plus 1 plus 2. It's a 5-year process we've got going on here. It doesn't end at AUT for Liam at the end of year 1. He's now got 2 more years to go from provisionally registered to fully registered. It would be nice to think that we could actually think about that as a continuum that is joined up and everybody's got a role to play backwards and forwards across it.
We do things slightly differently. We're employment based, so our people are in schools for 2 years while they're completing their teaching qualifications. So we do have a lot of practicum experience in our program, and we do have the benefit of the school supporting as well. So our participants receive support from all ends, from the provider, also from the school, and it's we'd like it to be seamlessly interwoven. It's, schools are crazy places and it's very variable. But yeah, it would be ideal if the IT and the school could all weave that together. Yeah.
In researching an article on this topic a few weeks ago, that was one of the big things that came out of it for me, was that the partnership between the provider and schools could be better. And it wasn't so much that the fault was lay anywhere, it was more that there perhaps need to be more funding for schools. There needed to be just more funding for the whole set up in this continuum that we're talking about. Does the panel agree? Does there need to be, what would it take to strengthen that partnership?
Yeah, not to harp on about the pay and conditions, but the time as a leader within the school to connect, with the rest of the sector is really, really important, and that's one part of it. So if we had time within our system for my deputy principals to maybe do a little bit more of my role so that, I could connect with the sector more, I think those things would be able to be, brought to the front a little bit better. But, at the moment, like you say, they're crazy places, and most of the day you're dealing with the crazy. So, yeah.
And it's another point that was made in that article was that teacher education is often sort of seen as somehow separate from the education system, and that might be reflected in why it's not, that partnership isn't as tight. How do you think that, why has that happened? How have we allowed that to happen? Teacher education's over here and then the education system's here.
Well, I maybe others might disagree. I think it might be a bit overstated. I mean, we actually work really closely with our practice community. I guess we place a lot of them, because we have to make the requirements of the Teaching Council and others. We worry at the present moment we're placing too many demands on the schools that we're working with in terms of, curriculum and assessment design, which is a requirement in the new standard. So, that's a lot to ask of schools. We're also putting people out in schools to do practice work and expecting teachers in schools to mentor them, to sign them off, to be part of the assessment decision. So I think actually the rhetoric might be that there's not a lot of joined upness, but actually in terms of a lot of the work we're doing, it's about developing those partnerships and reinforcing them. So I think what it feels like from a university perspective maybe is that schools rightly think that somebody's got the resources to help them do that, and it's the universities. Well, it isn't. It should be the government funding schools to be equal partners in this endeavour, and it doesn't seem to me that they are.
Silly things like the tutor-teacher allowance for a primary teacher to support a student in their class. I don't think it's been changed since 1982. So I think they get $47 a week or whatever it is.
$3.19 an hour.
Yeah,
$3.19 an hour.
It's actually
really well.
It's actually ridiculous to think. So people do it because they want to do it and they want to support the profession, but that goodwill is, exhausting.
From what I've seen, the school that I've been placed at and the relationship between universities has been quite close. I know our adjunct lecturer has been part of the design of our program. And then the teacher that I've been placed with, she's not just a mentor teacher, she's not just a of someone I'm observing. We call them professional learning mentors. So they're expected to have that kind of critical discussion with us and be reflective. And it's not a hierarchical system. It's it's a relationship.
Yeah.
So from what I've seen, it's quite strong at the moment, but that's just my opinion.
Good, I'm hearing a lot of positive things, guys. Very much to work with. Have we got any questions from the audience at this point for the panel? Any questions?
Yeah, can I put myself up there?
Yes,
You
please
guys
do.
are all wonderful, but you haven't mentioned early childhood.
That's a good point, Celeste.
That is coming, but what way is a perfect opportunity to now, perhaps. We haven't talked about early childhood. Actually, there's a question from one of our readers, and I'll read it here. It says, after achieving Bachelor of Early Childhood, why is it that we still have 2 years of registration when our appraisals within the company we work for do the exact same thing? It is double the work, and really, had I known the work involved, I would not have entered the teaching profession. After a degree, you are mentally exhausted, then to face double the work for the first 2 years is ridiculous. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I looked at the teachers. I wrote Pauline down beside that one.
I've got this one with my name on it, actually.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and I've heard quite a lot, particularly in the ECE context, of graduating teachers going through what seemed to me like almost a repeat of a tertiary program as part of their induction. And I think that that's being generated by employers trying to do the right thing, actually. It's a bit like appraisal in this case as well, where people are trying to do everything really perfect and actually, they're making it really difficult by doing that. The induction and mentoring 2 years is something that we raised with teachers when we recently looked at our registration policy. And there was a bit of a sense of, should we actually take away that 2 years and just say you meet your full practicing certificate at the point in time when you actually meet the standards? But there was a real strong view from almost all of the teachers around the table that said, here's a thing that we actually do get some resourcing for. And in reality, you do need at least 2 years. It is about experience and being in different contexts that gives you the confidence that you can confidently be a teacher independently, and therefore, we should keep that 2 years of induction and mentoring. But the guidance that we produce around that, which we are going to have a look at again shortly, is actually pretty light. So it's really saying this is about supporting you in your relationships, your emotional kind of stability as you're going through all the complex things of being a teacher, to help you answer questions, to connect you into where there might be professional learning that you're going to need as you go into new situations. Certainly isn't intended to be an onerous other kind of intellectual program or practice.
Yeah, I have to say, I agree with you, Pauline, it isn't. But I suspect that there's some people that have felt it to be rather more punitive than it needed to be.
Yeah.
I think, I don't think that's not been my perception of it.
Yeah.
But,
and I think with early childhood, teachers not being seen as a teacher, choosing to specialise in early childhood, as opposed to, teachers in high schools and separated off as different to primary teachers. I think there's a bit of a market for private individuals to come up with all these programs that you have to do. And I think if teachers in early childhood, as everywhere else, just went back to the teaching council requirements around registration and gaining full registration initially over those first 2 years, everyone would be a lot better off.
Yeah.
And the workload would be far more manageable.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yes, question of them.
I'm an overseas trained teacher with the experience of 17 years. I did my doctorate over there and have enriched experience, I feel. And when I came over here, I struggled a lot to enter in the teaching profession. I applied to schools and everyone says that you don't have any registration, nobody can entertain you. Then I got a job in PTE And I applied to Teaching Council with my all documents and everything. And they sent me an email that you have an enriched experience of 17 years, your qualification, I did my master's and doctorate. And they wrote in a very good way. And I was a registered teacher in overseas, fully registered teachers with more than a decade of experience. And now, till over here, I'm in the way of getting a registration. I didn't get any registration yet. I'm working in a PTE over here from last 3 years. I'm doing a TER over here in these days.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is over here that when one country is supporting me from where I am, and I feel that now I'm getting into the system of over here in the country also, and my appraisals are showing exceeding expectations, that why overseas teachers are not getting their proper rights over here.
It's not the first time I've heard a situation like yours. And I'm curious, I don't know if anyone in the panel would
Who's brave enough? Yeah.
brave enough to answer that, or would like to have a go, or even has the answers, I don't know. But Pauline, do you have any perspective on the
Well, it's really
situation with
difficult to
overseas?
tell on an individual case.
Yeah.
And this is kind of registration, which isn't my great area of knowledge. But I think the general principle comes from what the law says around what can be recognised as teaching experience and what can't be. So, interestingly, the legislation actually only counts teaching in New Zealand as teaching. And so when the Teaching Council sets registration, it actually can't count teaching that's happened overseas. And then the other thing about entry is really how the qualifications that you already have get reviewed. And the New Zealand Qualifications Authority have done a lot of work in the past to work out which countries and which particular qualifications can they say we know about these ones, we know the institutions, these ones just go through automatically. And then there's another set, and anything outside that they make a judgment on, is it the same level, does it cover the same kind of qualification, and then if you get through that, then it's pretty much, have you got any like police vet type stuff and getting through English language competency. So there's a whole lot of things that the law kind of sets out, and it is difficult in the sense that there's not one easy kind of place to go. There's lots of different parts of the system that you have to try and navigate. So the agencies that each have a part in that have all got together and tried to make one set of information, make it faster for the people that have come from the countries that have been already kind of reviewed, and trying to make the system faster. But in a way, every individual case is different, and it's not an easy thing to answer just on a theoretical thing.
Yeah, I'd say too, you're hitting the system at a real critical time where schools are finding the expertise within the system to support overseas trained or new teachers within the system is getting light. We just think of my school at the moment, we have 4 beginning teachers, we have 3 overseas trained. So there's 7 people who need, a mentor and advice and guidance programming. So, it might not be that when we see somebody who's overseas trained, we don't recognise that their qualifications and their experience are of standard. It's just we can't support to the level that we probably need to within the structure that we've got. And the other side to it is probably around the cultural competence that is needed to teach in our diverse in New Zealand. And I think too the system struggles to provide that within the system that it's already got, let alone for people coming in from overseas. So that's just my 2 cents.
I could get myself into real trouble here, and I know there are people in the audience who are going to answer this, know the detail much more than I do. But I think that the TER system, which is supported, where the government is supporting people to to inverted commas upskill, that's probably the wrong word, for the New Zealand system is actually really important. I do think people who are overseas trained, I think, just to pick up on the points that have just been made, around the culture that they're going to work in, the history of the system they're working in, and the curriculum that they'd be expected to deliver, to actually have some upfront training and teaching in that, which there's a couple of providers in New Zealand doing, is actually probably really important. And I think you picked up on the fact that you've now involved in the TER program, and I think that is a pathway into registration that Pauling's talking about also. And I personally think, from a position of the New Zealand education system, that's an important thing to do for people who are coming in from overseas.
I did want to pick up on this topic of supply and demand, and everyone knows at the moment we've got a teacher shortage on our hands, and I haven't been an education journalist for that long, but in that time I've seen the seesaw flip like that between oversupply, shortage, oversupply. What role do teacher education providers have to play in this, and how closely do you think we should be working with government to keep it on keel?
Well,
avoiding my
it's a me question. Well, the interesting thing is the government about 18 months ago, less than perhaps, set up a teacher education workforce planning group. Ask yourself, they set it up about 12 to 18 months ago. I mean, really? Where has it been up until then? And the interesting thing about it is until about 3 months ago, there was no initial teacher education provider on the group at all.
Right.
So, I mean, you could actually wonder what the Ministry of Education was thinking when they set that group up. Did they think that the ITE providers weren't important in the mix?
So has it changed since then?
Well, there's one person from the University of Canterbury is now a member of that group. I have to say the work was done. The first tranche of work had already been completed before she joined the group. But I have to say the workforce plan is not a bad plan. There is just no idea of how they're going to get from current state to the future state.
Right.
In fact, I was told in a meeting when I asked a ministry official, how are we going to get from here to here? And she said, I think that arrow means, and then a miracle happened. So I didn't feel great about that. But I think this is, I'm sorry, I'm sounding like a breaking record, but, the joined up system is not, needs to be a bit more joined up.
So you think there needs to be more ITE provider voice at the table on a lot of these conversations, Mark?
Well, I mean, if we're only one player in the education system, but we are an important player for the beginning of people's teaching careers. And so I think we do need to be at the table.
I agree. I think IT providers need to be at the table. We certainly pushed that view with the ministry and invited the ministry workforce people onto our ITE advisory group. It's been a struggle to get them to be there, actually, because it is such a critical part. I think one of the only silver linings, I guess, out of the crisis that we're in is that people are paying attention now to data and how do you get it, and what don't we have and what do we need for the future. Because you will have seen in the media, many people were still debating that there was actually a shortage till reasonably recently.
Until they got out of power and then they recognised there was one.
And why didn't the government fix it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been part of a workforce group now for 18 months, and when we started, I'll reiterate what was said, the ministry just did not have the numbers in terms of teacher supply, property supply, classrooms, and I'm talking about an Auckland context. And I'll acknowledge they've done a huge amount of work in that time, but we're starting on the end of a crisis that's already formed to gather those numbers and those needs. Yeah.
It's just if I can say, it is so frustrating. It is so frustrating. I was on the working group that was started in 2015 under the last collective agreement when we were saying there was a shortage. They were saying there was no shortage. There were recommendations in there that have simply not been actioned, and being told that the ITE stuff was completely outside the remit of what the ministry was doing because it came in under tertiary and it was a different area.
Well, that's
like
my point about being
screaming from the beach. Hugely frustrating.
We have raised a potential solution for the future, but it needs a bit of working through with the Tertiary Education Commission. where they already do for some industries that are possibly easier to manage than teaching, where they kind of set a workforce forecast of numbers, and they use that as their investment planning process moves forward. So providers are able to have a look and say, well, what does the industry think their needs are for the next 5 and 10 years, and then how do they respond to that? So we're looking at how, from the data the ministry has and the work that TSC do, we might put together teaching expectations. It might not be something that is that useful the first time round, but you've got to sort of start it and see whether actually that can become our way of thinking about that.
Thank you. Here's a question. I've got an enduring interest in the initial training of teachers, and I'm very interested in theory and action in terms of what's happening in the colleges and the universities in terms of training teachers. And I think there is a lot to be learnt about modelling the way. I think that I'd like to know what's done to ensure the currency and the quality of the people who are training the teachers for what they're going up to. Because the more I speak to students and to teachers, then I think there are behavioural problems and issues that they are not ready for. But it's more than that. I think someone talked about relationships as well. So I've worked in the early childhood sector a very long time ago. I've worked at training university teachers to teach here and overseas. And I'm very interested to know what's happening and what's done to assure that quality and currency of the initial people training.
Would that be coming in the requirements, Pauline, or was that addressed?
It's a level of detail that I'm not quite sure. I know in the old requirements we did, but I think it's an area that we've moved away from and left it to providers.
Providers to look after their own and ensure that level.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that is very much part of, I think, of any ITE provider that I know of anyway, very much part of us thinking about the mix of staff that we're putting in front of students, how current, what is their current, what is their academic qualifications, their currency, and what, as us, as a whole faculty in this case, what are we doing to maintain our links with the practice community? So, the fact of the matter is that our lecturers, some of them probably haven't been our classroom teacher for a while, but they are spending a lot of their week in classrooms working alongside teachers and our students in schools. So that's the way in which we maintain currency. And by bringing people into our profession from classrooms. I have to say that it's one of the things that, as a dean, who's that's part of my responsibility, is making sure that I've got the right people in this faculty. One of the things that, in fact, all of the deans in universities have spent some time worrying about is where is the future workforce in the universities, because one of the things that all of the universities, apart from I think Canterbury, have now got away from is the ongoing education of teachers. So, being ongoing professional learning and development. And that has actually been a source where we have actually had teachers who've come out of classrooms, they've been PLD providers for a while, they've upgraded their qualifications, and then they become part of the university staff. So they have got the things that you're talking about, recent experience, they're great teachers. Actually, the government changed the way in which it funded all of that. The universities all went, we cannot. This university couldn't keep on losing money like it was losing on that. So that's really vital source of our new intake. There's a couple of people over there who came in exactly by that route. We've sort of lost that, and we, if you're worrying about your future workforce like I am, then that is a concern. Where are we going to get the people to pick up on the point you're making?
Yeah, good point. Does anyone have anything to add on that? Your experience with your
Not your problem,
tutors?
fortunately.
Yeah.
You've got other problems to deal with.
I always wonder, though, whether there's a real disjoint in terms of the privatisation of the delivery of ITE provision, yet it's the ministry's responsibility to ensure there's enough workforce within it. And I just wonder whether that mix isn't right. And I don't know how we solve that. But
Sorry, the mix what?
Well, when you've got, the ministry who are responsible for making sure there's enough teachers in their classrooms, yet the delivery of that ITE provision is,
Right.
for a sense, privatised out. And so the winds that blow across what you probably need to do in terms of a fiscal responsibility to the university, the decisions you need to make around that. I wonder whether those two gel well enough.
Yeah, I mean, except that in the aside from the early childhood sector, in terms of primary and secondary schooling, actually it is not more than 90% of the people entering the teaching profession are coming out of the university sector. In early childhood, it's completely different. It's about 37% out of the university sector, some out of the polytechnics, and the other vast bulk out of the private training establishment sector. So, it is still pretty much a government game in the compulsory sector anyway.
You mentioned behavioural issues and not being ready for that. Were you referring to the children that are coming in?
I turned the radio on the car the other day on the station. I shouldn't have been listening.
We won't tell.
Talk back.
Someone was talking about you've given up teaching because of the behavioural issues in the secondary schools, and that it was like the elephant in the room, but it wasn't being talked about, and so and it just seems to be, according to him, I don't even know who he was, had been silenced over. And so teachers were under a huge amount of stress, and it wasn't just teachers bullying students, it was students bullying teachers. And often teachers didn't want to talk about it because they felt, a failure.
I think this is something that's coming up increasingly. I'm seeing it certainly the increasingly complex behavioural and learning needs. Even at my children's school, and I'm chair of the board for that school, and the new entrance teachers in the last 5 years have said they've seen more and more increasingly complex behavioural and learning needs, which they're stated with, and you go to talk to people and you're in this line of work and I'm realising it's not just them, it's across, seems to be everywhere. Do you feel the pressure of that as providers to equip our teachers with those sorts of skills as well as everything else that you've got to equip them with, the curriculum and everything else? The pressures of children who are coming to school with more needs than they did 10 years ago. Michelle, what's on that?
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely, absolutely. We feel a lot of pressure to equip our teachers to be able to stand in the classroom and to handle whatever's thrown at them. I mean, it's all interconnected, right? We've got everything feeds into this, socioeconomics and poverty and the impact of all of those things. And awareness, we also have to equip them with awareness of who they can go to, because the teacher in the classroom cannot be the one-stop shop for everything, cannot be the counsellor or the psychologist.
So there is that expectation increasingly that is the teacher's role. They are that one-stop shop, right or wrong. That seems to be the way it's...
Some of it's learning, like teaching our teachers to recognise when the bar is and what you're expected to cope with and what you're not. Because, like you say, a lot of teachers will try and cope with things that are beyond them because they don't know, or there might be a sense of shame around that.
Right.
But again, I don't think the ministry actually understand the depth of the problem. They fund, say, all students within schools for the top 2 or 3% of behavioural needs. Yet schools will probably say that sits somewhere in a 10 to 15% bracket. So the data that the ministry collects basically only in that what they're providing for support around, say, those particular students, but they have no understanding of the level of depth that sits below that. For example, in my school at the moment, we fund, out of an ops grant that hasn't been increased in the last 4 years, we fund $120,000 over what we get from the government to put support in place for our teachers and teacher aides and support staff. I mean, I think the system is broken. That's where I go back to that. Someone needs to have a courageous conversation, because choice is fantastic too within schools, and kids having the choice to go to where they want to go. But sometimes a courageous conversation needs to be had around actually the best place for a child is maybe not in this context, but within this context. But I think probably too in the last 15 or 20 years, those contexts have shrunk. Those options for parents have disappeared. Yes. And, I think about when I was out in West Auckland, the behavioural school that was out there that this is for extreme cases of behaviour, but the number of beds within that facility to help these children reintegrate into school just continually shrunk. And I think now there's probably 12 beds across Auckland. So I think we've got to look at it as a system, but not just as schools, but as interconnected providers who can be the best place for kids. And it's not around, it's around equity for everyone within the system, but it's also around, just making sure that those kids, when they're within that system, get connection with a place that's going to be the best for them. So I think it's much bigger than just a school. It's around those contexts that sit beyond as well.
Yeah, much bigger than teachers. And I think, one of the things that maybe is a sort of green shoot or a glimmer of hope out of the budget, the well-being budget so-called, was this idea that actually there need to be more professionals in schools with the social workers, counsellors and the like, who can actually work alongside teachers to help assist and address these issues. Because as Michelle was saying, classroom teachers got lots of other things they have to deal with, and they need assistance. We need specialists who are doing that work.
Yeah. Liam, what are your thoughts of someone going into schools with these, knowing that you're going to come across kids with all range of challenges and
it's like we've had various lectures on different needs, but I'm there for a year, and with the increasing workload of teachers, it's an increasing workload for the university to teach us as well. I think for us we just have to have an awareness and a willingness to help. And I completely agree with what Michelle's saying about the specialist help within schools. I was relating it to a successful business. You have people that are experts in those various fields within a business to make it all work together. And yes, teachers are expected to do a lot, but I think we need to be willing to ask for help from others in the schools.
And having those people well positioned in schools is part of it. Yes.
I was just going to say, I've got a number of friends who are curriculum advisors in schools who are now resource teachers for learning and behaviour, and they say the difficulty now is when perhaps I trained 40 years ago, for the first couple of years you could almost be guaranteed, in a primary school, I was primary not secondary, to get a reasonable hand-picked class so that you could really learn to teach without having major behavioural problems or even major learning needs. But they were saying the numbers have increased so much that even our very young university teachers might have 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 of these students with high learning needs or high behaviour needs in their class, and they're just learning to teach. So it just adds that extra level of difficulty, because a lot of them feel like they can't just call on their mental teacher because their mental teacher's got 5, 6 or 7 of these high needs students as well. And so it is raising the level of extra.
I think the delivery models, though, too, have modified quite a bit over the years. And I'll talk about RTLB, and this isn't, the wonderful people who do a wonderful job. However, the delivery model has slowly stepped away from children, and so it's now around supporting, and rightfully so, teacher and family. But, at some point it's got to also be that huge investment of having all of those people. It's got to be in front of kids. Now, I've got a situation in my school where we've had a child psychologist involved with a student for 18 months, and that psychologist has done no psychology with the kid. So why have that person involved at that expense? It's been working with teachers and families, and that's really important. But actually, the expert is there for the kid. And so that delivery, we've really got to look closely at what those delivery models are and how we're getting experts in front of children and that resource in front of kids.
Really good point. Any other questions on that? Yes?
I'm Tom here from Queenstown, and I'm not actually in the military school sector, but I'm just interested in it. Just wondering if there's an increase in behavioural issues or behavioural learning within schools, is that like saying that we maybe have to look at how we are teaching, or look at a different way in which we're delivering? Because if there's an increase, it's actually telling us something as a community. We're not giving these children certain what they need, and it could be as basic as
they're not feeling loved, they're not feeling cared. And when you're going through that, I understand once you get increasing numbers in your classes, it makes it harder. But sometimes all they need is some love. So, and I think that for you, sometimes bring in these extra psychologists actually makes the child feel their self-esteem drops because they know they're not the same as, they just want to be like their mates in the classroom. So I'm just wondering, is it, we're talking about reimagining. I'm not hearing any reimagining, so when we're given these sort of situations, they're given you opportunities actually looking at, okay, what needs are, what are they missing, what are our children really screaming out for? The behavioural issues are because they're screaming out that they're in defence mode. They're missing something. So what is it they're missing? What isn't the education system, what isn't our initial teacher training or our teachers being shown or helping to give our children?
I mean, Mark, in your faculty, are you constantly reflecting on those sorts of things and
Yes.
and researching, drawing on the evidence and looking at what's happening in other jurisdictions and on our own doorstep?
And I guess, I mean, this is a sort of another beef, I guess, and one that I think sort of picks up on this point in a sort of a long-term way, I get. But, in New Zealand, we import a lot of educational thinking. We are not generating it ourselves. So if I take a comparison, in the health sector, the government invests annually about $105 million to support scientists and researchers doing research around healthcare, around finding the cure for cancer, etc., etc. The New Zealand government invests annually $1.5 million a year in a dedicated fund that people working in tertiary institutions usually, but having to be alongside providers, to do research on what's happening in our schools and our communities. That's, a 100-fold difference in the amount of money that is being spent in research. And yet, I would dare to say that actually when the cure for cancer is discovered, it won't be in New Zealand, but we will still benefit from it. But actually what's happening in our classrooms and our society is unique to New Zealand, and without the work done to understand that and then be able to turn that into practice programs for IT providers, for professional development, for teachers and all those sorts of things, we are just not addressing the sort of problems that you're talking about.
I mean, I'm doing my PhD in education. I'm actually an academic development, so I'm totally different, but similar in teacher training. So just, and my girls have just left the put up and have gone to Newton, so I'm really interested in it, especially in the way culture. But talking to educators all the time, and my Māori advisors being Car and Tāwhiri Williams, who are at IT but from Kaupapa Māori, how can we look at our own, don't be fearful of looking at Kaupapa Māori, because when you look at Kaupapa Māori, they know, their teachers know how to deal with the behavioural issues. They're not trained, they just know instinctively to build us on the marae. So it's how do we actually start looking at some of these behavioural issues, and instead of looking at them as deficits, go, hey, what's that potential that this child is showing us that they have? So really flipping the model from being this deficit, it puts the psychologist in there. So what is this child telling us? What can we do from the, let's see what potential we can grow with this child. So it's, I guess I really want to get to that reimagining. Let's have the courage and actually do something that is reimagining. Where actually it's not. You're just going back to some grassroots basic needs.
Yeah, I think though, coming back to your point earlier, until there's some sort of political willingness to have that longer term view, every 3 years the political winds blow across what we're doing and change quite dramatically the things that we are or aren't able to do within schools. I'm part of a workforce group at the moment that's looking at a strategy for the workforce for 2032. And you just know in your heart that next year, if there's a new political party, that's going to be sitting on a shelf. We've come up with some fabulous reimagining but there's got to be some real political will to actually say this is actually what we believe and this is what we're going to drive for, and we're going to be relentless about that.
Do you think it's ever going to be like that groundswell?
I think we're getting pretty close to a critical moment where the sector's either going to blossom or implode. And I'm hoping we're going to blossom, but we feel like we're on implosion at the moment. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean,
I just want to tautoko exactly what you're saying. We do need to reimagine what we're doing in education, and that critical mass. It's coming right into 2032. Half of the people are going to be Māori and Pacific, and I'm just going to call it. It's Māori and Pacific who feature in all the negative statistics, and in the incarceration and the behavioural problems. And as one of these people, there definitely needs to be a reimagining. I think we get caught up in playing the short game quite a lot. And we're playing the short game right now, like dealing with the government and pay and things when actually the long game means that how are we going to cater for the fact that half our population in a matter of years is going to look very different to what it does now, and we're still dealing with a colonial system.
And I think a lot of schools are really trying to do that. We've been for years trying to develop a curiosity-based curriculum, a 5 to 7 year old program that doesn't reflect, and I hate to say it, the New Zealand curriculum, because we want it to be around play and connection and key competencies and learning to be, just a good kid, ready to launch into education. But when you have structures particularly around things like Ero, coming in and saying to us, well, give us that piece of paper that shows us what that program's like. Well, we don't know what it's like because tomorrow it might change. And so to be really involved in that, that sort of that notion of meeting needs and being curious about learners and where they're going and providing that, the system has to adapt. And and I think thinking around education and schools and things that are being tried in schools, and whether that's overseas influence or not, are really trying to forge ahead. But the system is it's like having a backpack on that's full of lead. Sometimes it's not being reactive enough behind schools to support innovation.
I mean, the temptation is always to look at Nordic countries like Finland and Norway and also Canada, because actually it is one of the things they did do was actually say, let's stop the internecine war here and let's actually look at the whole system and figure out how we're going to do it better. I know there's lots of things that don't apply here, but I mean the idea that there would be a consensus that would work long term to deal with these issues that we all know are coming is quite, you sort of look at it and go, why not? Why can't we do that here?
If you put hands up, Mel, you.
Yeah, sorry, I've got 5 million things now. One was around the idea of the separation of the institutes, and that there's no overview of the sector. So there are still, someone was telling me about a teacher provider place that 30% PE is still coming through their course. So there's not that systemic, that look at what does the system actually need, which brings these people in and then have nothing to do. But I was actually also thinking, and I'd hate to make the mistake of thinking that what was happening is still what was happening when I was trained. But when I was trained, which was about 10 years ago, we would have been lucky if we did 6 hours on specific learning needs. And so I was interested in what, Liam's experience was of teacher training around specific learning needs with that. And I think coming into this as well, as I was at a meeting with NZQA, and they're running specific courses for new teachers around standards-based assessment, because that's not being taught in ITE to the level they need it to be, which for me is an absolute failure in the system of what's going on if you're looking at secondary. And so, sorry. I think I've got about 4 questions there, but at least it wasn't a statement.
Liam?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. It was a bit of a statement there.
What you've had to do on specific learning needs so far from your
Yeah, so we have had focus on some specific needs. We've had lectures about hearing impaired learners, visually impaired, former immigrants as well. But one of the best kind of lectures that I got was on universal design for learning. So rather than on specific needs, it's a way of how we can make our classroom a better place for everyone, regardless of their need. And yeah, I got quite a lot out of that rather than focusing on this child's specific need and this child's specific need and that child's specific need. How entering into the profession, setting up a classroom for the first time, assuming that classroom physically was able to do that, on paper, looked like quite a good system. Yeah.
Excuse me, everyone, I was just struggling. Sorry, you had a question up the back.
I was interested with two parts in teacher education. So one is having great initial teacher education programs. The second one is attracting great people into the process to start with. And it does, there's very little research. We're certainly talking about the needs for salary, but very little research as to how students thinking of going to teaching see the behavioural issues that they're going to face. And interestingly, it's coming out of a secondary school. So a few of my students were interested in going into secondary teaching. Yeah. So going into teaching was almost primary because when you asked them why don't you go to secondary, they didn't want to deal with the behaviour that observed themselves as students. And we seem to keep, and it's great to say, well, we could be doing more for those kids, but when you start to place that requirement on people that they should be, you actually make it even less likely that they'll want to take on the responsibility of the job. So how do we create a system where the best people who would like to be our teachers, because the New Zealand University research has shown whereabouts the university graduates that go teaching are on the picking order and they're not at the top. No. So how do we get further up that list to get them into a profession which they're not going to feel a lot of the issues are going to be taken here in the social and personal problem. How do you get them?
Oh boy. I mean, Kate sitting down here, who's our marketing and comms person, so we have this conversation endlessly about how do we connect. And I guess, if you're talking secondary, just for the moment, I mean, there are people who have degrees, so how do we get to those students, usually in other parts of the university, to actually have good conversations with them about what teaching is about? Because by the time they've got to that point, they have got 3 years away from the secondary school, and maybe they've forgotten, but they've started to remember the positive aspects of their life as in secondary school, and we work quite hard to get students into this place from the city campus to here, and to have conversations with students in programs about what they're experiencing, so that they can start thinking about being a teacher. We've also done some work with our colleagues in the faculties of arts and science to actually start to introduce what are now called in the parlance in the university modules, so that we can actually attract people into having tasters of what, not teaching, because it's very, very complex to get a non-IT student into a school, but actually thinking about learning and what learning's about, and actually all the places in society that learning takes place, like museums, art galleries, etc., to actually get them, whet their appetites about what being an educator is, so they might actually think more positively about education as a career. But it's a very, very long game, and it's about having lots of different things adding together to get a bit of a groundswell, and that's sort of where we're heading, but it's just very, very difficult.
I think lots of different pathways need to be available to teachers. Like we managed to attract 840 applicants to 80 places last year in teaching, and that's in the hard to staff subjects, and I know that Jeremy's going to pick up on something like that in a moment, but it's a range of pathways, and recruiting from communities. Pipelines need to exist so that kids can come through from those communities, to go back into those communities, because no one's ever going to, if you're I'm speaking from a Pacific education point of view right now, but if you go back to the community that raised you, you're going to feel the duty to serve that community, and you're going to be able to better handle whatever happens within that community as well. So we've made a particular point of recruiting from those communities.
Yeah, and I guess, and to pick up on that success of getting that many applicants, goes back to the point that I made in an article I wrote, is why aren't we paying people to do initial teacher education, which is what Teach First New Zealand is able to do. Pay them to do their initial teacher education.
Not very well, but...
Well, better than them paying us. They're not paying us or taking a student allowance.
If you're doing Teach First before you end up at that base point, isn't it?
2 and then another 2. So 2 and you're registered, and then another 2 and you're certified.
Yeah, then you're 3 years for your degree, so...
Yes.
Yes.
But,
so you're looking at 7 years, you'd be a doctor.
Can I do this and pass over to my colleague who was going to say something?
Yeah, I guess just the point about behaviour issues is definitely sort of riling something within me, because I think about my experience and in terms of behaviour issues, it's absolutely relationship, but I also think it's about challenging my own definitions of success and just to talk about what was said over here, over here was fantastic. I just think, what do we have currently, or what could we have that challenges both initial education definitions of success and also, if we're talking about teacher education and ongoing professional development, how do we challenge our own definitions of success? Not just for facing the kids we face and in terms of serving the communities, but also in a world that is rapidly changing. Because I would say that influences behaviour. How do we challenge definitions of success?
I think, though, fundamentally we don't understand the cost to go through for a child to go through the kura and go through that pathway and to be able to access that at a primary, secondary level and into a tertiary institution. That child should have the ability to have that pathway, and by doing that too, providing that pathway, they will have hopefully the ability to see, the success and all those sorts of things. Maybe, teaching is the option in that, but we don't as a system want to acknowledge the cost that's going to be associated with creating that success for that child. And until we do, we're going to continue to, to mould within a fiscal envelope. And I know we've got restrictions, but it's a fairly crucial part of society that we get this one right.
Okay. I think the other thing is that the research is showing that children's brains are rewiring very rapidly, more rapidly than any other point in time. And we're of this age and this generation, like my generation or the one behind me, we're still thinking like this. These children coming through our early childhood services and through our early parts of the school and onto our high schools these days have a different way of thinking to the children only 10 to 15 years ago. And that was when the word differentiation was a real buzzword. My husband's in high school, I'm in early childhood. And so we had some very, very tenuous conversations about how differentiated learning looked in the two sectors and what was possible and what wasn't possible. But if we don't adapt to the society that our children are growing into, are born into, we're going to be having the same conversation in another 10 years, in another 20 years, and nothing really is going to change. It'll be like trying to turn a massive oil tanker around. We've got to be brave, we've got to be standing together as an education sector, right from those who work with very new babies, right through to, I would suggest, well into 21, 22, children with special needs that are really needing support right through the system. Because if we don't stand together to make some changes, we're talking to the conversion.
Pauline, you talked about working with the iwi. Has there been any thoughts with the iwi to work more closely and in partnership with the ITs? If they're not getting the funding from the government, even if getting the treaty settlements, I'm going to say it, I'm in Te Whare, I know what we're getting. Mark is my phone, but it's...
Good luck with that.
Look down south, Kaikahu, Kainui, why aren't you partnering with iwi so that they can bring in their people, give them the scholarship, give some empowerment back to the people in the community? That's like what Michelle said. There's a sense of duty when we're having this, and it's easy because we kind of go, hey, I know your uncle, but hey, that's how we fix the behaviour. Or hey, and I used to do it with my students, and I used to lecture, hey, I know your uncle, and they'll cut it out, and they know their limits. But when you're in the classroom with your auntie or your uncle, you have to behave, and there's an expectation that as a family, as a marae. And I think, there's an opportunity there. If ITVs actually start building partnerships and circles with that community.
Thank you. I love the ideas coming from that.
But I mean, this is if you look at the teaching council requirements, that is one of the requirements of ITC, that they are consulting with iwi and involving them in conversation. So that's a very complex thing to do, as you probably appreciate, and that's something that we are at this very moment talked about it in my office today about how we're going to keep that conversation going, how we're going to improve it, how we're going to make it more productive for both sides of the table, so to speak. It's a great suggestion, but it's incredibly complex work, and it's a demand that we have to meet. So it's a very, very important thing to do. It's a very, very hard thing to do at the same time.
I think it is a hard thing to do, but I think part of the reason that it is hard is because we're coming at it from what we know and then trying to fit iwi into what we're already doing. And I think where we've found models that are successful is starting with iwi. And that is really a flip again. So it's saying actually the way our system is kind of designed at the moment is not going to be helpful for how we need it to be structured for the future. And we're at that time of change where it's such a great opportunity, and some iwi are already quite a long way down this path where they are already kind of nominating the people who are going to be teachers and saying we're going to get around you, we're going to support you, we want you to go and be teachers, and that's actually becoming a reality. And so I think we all have to have in mind what is the end game here and how do we try different things to be able to achieve it. And yes, we put it in our requirements because it's such an important thing, but in reality we get that it's going to be really difficult for an organisation who already has some things that they have to do to engage in a way that's going to actually get the sort of results that could be possible. So it's about trying to, I guess, set a direction, but then also find ways to move ahead and showcase that. Thanks.
And I think though too, trying to have that robustness within the system, but also maybe deconstructing what that idea of what a teacher is, and how we get to be in that place, and what other people can contribute to that environment. And I'm on a work group at the moment, they're using the word paraprofessional, which I don't necessarily agree with, but what all those people who contribute into the education for that child and who can add enormous value. At the moment, there's not a lot of flex within the system to be able to employ, to reimburse at a level that's appropriate for those people. So I think we've got to deconstruct maybe too, that concept that there's a teacher and we get there by doing this, and we actually have to have a look at all those different pathways and actually valuing people who might sit outside that norm and saying, actually, you add huge value into this education context, and we can remunerate you and value you, in a similar way.
If you start thinking of education more like an ecosystem where the state is doing a whole lot of things, but actually there are lots of not-for-profits and social ventures and different organisations that are either doing something new and fresh or picking up the pieces that the state isn't doing. If you start to think of that as all part of the education system, then there's huge opportunity. And I think one of the things that we limit ourselves on is by thinking how it's always been in the past, that actually we need to see it in black and white and we want to see how the funding works and all of that. If we kind of said that's less important, though of course it is important, but started thinking, so if this bit isn't working, what do we need to add? Where are we going to get that from? Who are the kind of people in the community that can support that? Being more involved with our health colleagues and others, then there is some opportunity for different sorts of solutions. That's a bit off ITE, but I think it's part of thinking for the future.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to talk about everybody, but Pauline, for thinking about doing things not as we've always done them, and also to say that we need to stand together. I totally agree with that. And also what the sissies about going to iwi, I sort of think that everybody should do everything. Like, it's on us to try and change everything in every way that we can. We've got to play the game at all the levels that there are, I think. And I think also part of that, the standing together, is the story that we tell. We need to stop telling the story about fixing all these broken kids, because it's the system that's broken and not the kids.
That's right, yes, quite right.
Well, we've had a lot of interesting discussions tonight. I think we could probably keep going all night. I would like to wrap things up perhaps by going along and having each panellist give their takeaway from this evening, or anything that's jumped out at them particularly from tonight's discussion. So Liam, if we cast that duty to you.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you to everyone for sharing your opinions and your knowledge, and to the panel as well. For me, just listening to the different conversations, a lot of it seems to kind of be societal challenges that we're facing, and the issues aren't going to be fixed in 90 minutes. But I think what Michelle was saying about standing together and all having the same common goal is going to be quite beneficial. For me, it's a very interesting time entering the profession, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the changes that do occur throughout my time.
Absolutely, thank you, Liam.
Kia ora, everybody. Kind of just said it, but also I guess the word or the challenge is for us to think about how we can collectively work to sort of engineer the systemic change that's needed to flip the script on those stories, and to tell it in different ways, and to actually dream what education might look like, which was the thing that was laid down in the education conversations but has not manifested. But how might we as a sector training teachers, how might we look to making that systemic change at all levels that we can? Kia ora.
Thank you. Mark?
I think we're sort of all saying the similar thing as a sector who educates teachers, because I think education is a very important word to use here. I just want it to be much more joined up. I don't want us all to feel like we are all working in different silos without, agencies, and it does come down to agencies of government in particular, working across the whole system and providing the leadership that we all need to move forward in the sorts of ways we've been talking about here.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate, I think that bold discussion, I don't think we actually understand what it means to educate a child, from start to finish, and the cost associated with it. And I don't want to keep going on about cost, but that is what it is about half the time. And we really do have to understand that before we can have an honest conversation with our communities around what that needs to be.
Thank you. Pauline, that's last.
I've really enjoyed this conversation because I think it is actually the profession in action, that when teachers come together collectively, we're best placed to be able to say, what could the solution be? Because actually you're the guys that have that in-depth knowledge and experience, so that you're able to propose the what if. And I think though there are lots of conversations that happen in government and those things will come to fruition, teachers themselves can actually do a lot when we come together and make choices collectively. You are every day in a classroom, whether it's educating new teachers. That T word keeps getting in the way, doesn't it? Or whether it's with children, but actually there's huge power in the room, and come up with some really great ideas. So that's great.
Thank you. And I think you said the word conversation, and for me that's the main thing we've achieved tonight, is having the conversation and getting some of these ideas out there. And they're not perfectly formed ideas by any shape, but they're all sort of on the right track and aligned with each other. So I'm quite excited to follow this conversation as it goes forward, and to delve in, and hopefully we meet in a year's time, we'll see some progress towards some of those lofty goals, but not so lofty goals. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along tonight. This wouldn't be possible tonight without the support of wonderful University of Auckland, who very kindly hosted it tonight. This is the first time we've taken ChalkTalks out of Wellington and into Auckland, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you, Kate, especially for your help with this, and we've really enjoyed partnering with you on this feature yet again, so it's been a pleasure to work with you. But my biggest round of applause that needs to go to our panellists here, so please.